Volkshaus. Meine Damen und Herren, das verschwindende 11 Jahre alte Hilde.
Welcome to Achtung History, Series 2, The Watcher. Produced by the Berlin Tour Guide and presented by Simon J. James. Subscribe to the Achtung History podcast on all major podcasting platforms and follow Achtung History on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Achtung History. Or visit theberlintourguide.com/Achtung History for updates. If you wish to support Achtung History, you can do so through Patreon at patreon.com/Achtung History. This is The Watcher, Episode 2, The Search. It appeared as if every worker of the Reichsbank and their families were in the streets around Sachsenplatz, shouting the name of little Hildegard Zäpernick. She had not been seen since her brother Kurt had last looked over his shoulder toward where he and his brother Wilhelm had been playing with a red rubber ball which they had left upon the street. It was a ball that his recently turned 11-year-old sister Hilda was pleased to finally be playing with now that her brothers were returning to the apartment, leaving it upon the street, allowing her finally to have a turn with it. The voices rang out across the square. The tight community that was the artists' colony, as some like to call it, but moreover it was a Reichsbank workers with some bohemian additions, predominantly all knew Hilda, or knew of her. Whilst many parents would have their differences with one another, the children were innocent and often paved the way in building bridges between sparring families, and were often the first in approaching new families to the area by branching out to the children that arrived, all with the intention of sharing in the innocent joys of youth. Hilda was one child who, known to most, was always thought over as a happy and spirited child, so it was of great disturbance and a shared concern that not only that she had been taken, but that it was also a concern that any child may have gone missing from this well-respected and close-knit community. Theodor Müller, upon hearing the news from the two women that had been talking semi-discreetly in front of his apartment building, rushed to get his bicycle. At best, he had hoped she had just wandered off, maybe towards her Lyceum and Preußenallee, or even towards her old elementary school on Leistikow-Strasse. Could she have wandered toward the green, lightly forested space around the Spandauer Bock building that belonged to the Spandauer Berg Brauerei? Maybe, he questioned. She had not wandered away. Perhaps with the growing use of the automobile and the access that people had, especially as there was a growing second-hand market, she had been taken. Either way, he wanted to help search, so into the dusk he cycled, calling out her name along the streets as he pedaled, his voice echoing between buildings and in courtyards, bringing more people to the awareness that something had happened. On Sachsenplatz, as Theodor Müller began his cycling, William Grote, as gardener, begins his own search. The gardens of Sachsenplatz were formed from an old gravel pit. From the street it may just look like a normal garden plat, but it is, however, quite different. It had been conceived at the same time that the district itself had been conceived in 1909. However, due to finances, delays, and principally the Great War, the work had barely begun by 1919. It would have been, if it was completed as initially planned, the newly appointed gardener for Schlossenberg, Erwin Barth's, first great commission for the city of Schlossenberg, and a tribute to the work of Barth's mentor, Fritz Enker's Klettenberg Gardens in Cologne. Barth had been tempted by the imperial majesty of Schlossenberg, the city that bordered the slowly growing and creeping boundaries of the Hauptstadt Berlin, but his ideas were very different to those who came before him. There was not to be the small fenced gardens with ornamental flower beds lining pathways. Rather, he preferred a feeling of the natural, a blend of the world of humans and nature coming together, and he wished, with the design of his new park, to create a clear and sharp break from the old garden styles that could be visited at the Schlossenberg Palace a short distance away. So within the old gravel pit, he designed the Brandenburg world in miniature. It would have falling limestone cliffs on the eastern half, like those in Rudersdorf. A large pond would be formed at the center of the western half to create a swampy environment for the fauna of Brandenburg, a notoriously sandy and swampy land. Pine trees that grew in abundance in Brandenburg but rarely seen in the city of Charlottenburg or Berlin would be planted rather than the more common oak, linden, or the sycamore. A children's playground would adorn one corner, and a small sheltered pavilion rising over the street another, as if some medieval fortress watchtower guarding the garden from those that may wish to disturb the relative peace within. Once the Great War had come to an end, finally the much-delayed plans were begun, and upon completion the maintenance and care was entrusted to William Grotte. He had stayed at the garden later, as he often did in the cooler evenings of the summer, to tend to the flower beds, pathways, and ornamental features of Sachsenplatz. For a Platz designed as a replica of the natural fauna of Brandenburg, it certainly took some maintenance to keep it looking natural. William Grotte, not Wilhelm, Willy with an I or Willy with a Y, lived over the rail tracks to the east in Charlottenburg proper, a city that now was, since the Greater Berlin Act of 1920, part of Berlin, much to the disgruntled displeasure of the people of the beautiful Charlottenburg, who thought themselves better than their Berlin neighbours. He had an apartment in Dankelmannstrasse at number 53, and had he been at home, it would have been much harder for the residents to search the park. Only he knew it well, and for much of the 2.3 hectares that constituted the area of the park, only he could enter, in order to preserve the plants from the heavy feet of the unappreciative. He meandered down the paths, keeping his eyes wide as they strained to see through the shadows that were growing darker and longer with the passing minutes since the first shouts had revealed that Hilda had been missing. There was always a fear that a child had found their misfortune on the stones that had been laid to resemble the limestone cliffs, so he checked with an assertive gaze the area where the cliffs met the grass. He knew the garden well, and was certain that his deep understanding of the area would display to him quickly a foreign object that did not belong within the garden walls. Lifting the branches of the low-lying bushes, he searched for a child in the thralls of a game of hide-and-seek, or a child that had fled a friend or foe. Further down into the base of the old gravel pit he moved. However, so far, not a trace of a footstep, but his own could be seen. No blades of wild grass were bent or broken, no leaves trodden, or even the rich brown of the mud imprinted with the crepe pattern of the sole of a shoe. At the water's edge of the pond he scans where the water sits still against the ground. Only a small trickle of water falls into the pond, to avoid the stagnation that would slowly result in starvation of oxygen from the waters. But the trickle is so small, the water has no ripples, it doesn't rise or fall, there is no shore, and furthermore no other traces are visible of the signs of a young girl wandering into the waters. Defeated and dejected, but confident Hilda is not within, he returns up the steep embankment. Climbing slowly against the gradient of the hill, he once again emerged at the street level, where an air of desperation was falling over the community, as more and more searches of places that Hilda was commonly known to frequent were revealed to be in vain. When he appeared at the gates, William Grotte was met by those hoping that his search had resulted in some sign, but with a shake of his head, the group that had gathered solemnly dispersed to investigate a different location. It was shortly before 8 that Heinrich Asch looked from his window of the upper floor of number 89 Westend Alley and noticed the commotion below. He had spent the late afternoon in the garden with Wilhelm Zäpernick and Herr Bergner, who also lived in the same building at number 89 where Hilda had been playing on the trellis to the displeasure of her mother. Bemused by the mass of people on the street, he decided to descend the shallow stairs and to investigate what the commotion may be. When he reached the street, one of those that he had viewed from his window, one of the frantic pedestrians asked him what the time might be, to which he looked at his wristwatch, replied that it was 6 minutes before 8. In front of the building he caught sight of a group of people that included Wilhelm Zäpernick. "What's going on?" Heinrich Asch asked. "Hilda's missing," Wilhelm Zäpernick replied, his gaunt face appearing even more sullen and sunken than usual, and his blue eyes were wide with fear. "Missing?" Asch repeated. "Her mother went to call her in at 7 to do her homework, but couldn't see her. No one's seen her for over an hour," Wilhelm spoke hurriedly. Where have you searched? All over. The building site? Heinrich pressed. On our way now, said Wilhelm. Anyone been to the police station or the hospitals? Heinrich pushed. Not yet. I'll go. If there's an accident on the building site, perhaps she was already taken to the hospital. Thoughts were very much now on an accident having happened on the Gilbau. Gathered on the corner, a stone's throw from the door to number 89, the group of men looked to the entranceway of the Gilsbau on the Sachsenplatz. Little more than 100 meters separated the two. They moved slowly towards the entrance to the building site. Between the gaps in the fences, they could see the bare brick walls awaiting render and dark spaces where someday light would emit from. They found the gate, a wooden construction held together by horizontal iron bars, and one singular, angled piece locked. They'd heard the gates being rattled not long before and presumed that it must have been the watchman securing the site to protect the workers' tools from greedy hands. A heavy padlock hung from a chain wrapped around the space between the two halves of the gate. In the dying light, a shadow could be seen wandering alone. They shout for the shadow to come closer, which it does. We need to search the building. I can't let you do that, the shadowy figure replied. That now, in walking from the shadows of the building, it was clear that it was the guard Schultz. Schultz was known amongst the residents, despite only being a guard on the Gilbau for a relatively short time. Schultz was a war veteran, an injured war veteran, and had been shot through the left eye whilst with the 9th Infantry Regiment Star Guard on the 7th of October 1914, near the small village of Shanoy. He was very new, even relatively so. In Berlin, having only relocated to the city in April and had been working for the Gilbau for only 5 weeks. But a one-eyed war veteran in a quiet district was hard to miss. I can't let you wander around the site, I'm afraid. Why not? One of the men pressed. I'm not allowed to. What's happened? Inquired Schultz. His daughter, Hilda, another of the men replied. She's missing. I'll have a look around the site for you, Schultz said helpfully. One of you wait here, I'll have a look and return. Schultz disappeared into the building site once again. Some of the men dispersed to continue the search for little Hilda Zäpernick elsewhere. Heinrich Asch was already far away at the police station ringing the bell. He inquired of the officers if a young girl had been found, and he provided them with a description. He could describe her well, having been a neighbour and friend of the Zäpernicks for a few years, but no luck. The police had not had any missing children handed in, but they had heard already of a disappearance. Heinrich Asch moved on. The hospitals were next. After half an hour, Schultz returned to the gate. The men moved closer to look through the gaps between the wooden boards at the guard, hopeful of news that there would be some. But alas, Schultz could only say that he had found nothing. There was nothing else to do but to continue the search of the wider area. There was, of course, the courtyard to search. Maybe she could have wandered to the U-Bahn station at the end of Schwarzberg Allee, Bahnhof Neue Westend, the station that was situated on the Platz that was predominantly yet to be built. She couldn't have been dejected by her mother's refusal to go to the gymnastic games with Waltraud, could she? The men departed. However, as they did so, a woman and a man approached the fence. They spoke through the gap to the guard as well and asked, "Have you seen little Hilda?" To which the guard again replied, "No." Once the couple were almost out of view, he unlocked the gate, slipped to the street side, relocked it, and proceeded to circle the Gilbau fence. The searchers continued with increased panic as the time ticked on, but with no trace of Hilda in the gardens. On the streets, the searchers kept coming back to the Gilbau that was slowly becoming the centre of the neighbourhood and everyone's fears. Gustav Flader was feeling advanced in his age. He'd been born in Neustettin, a small town, nothing comparable to the size of the real Stettin, before the formation of the German Reich, in the year that Prussia was at war with Austria. His age meant that he avoided the Great War, but he had celebrated his 52nd birthday on the day that the Kaiser was forced into exile and the German Republic, that had just been celebrated the previous day, was proclaimed. 11 years later, at the age of 62, He was not long from retirement, if it were to be possible. The recession of the earlier part of the decade had wiped away his, like most other Germans, savings. Now he needed the job, and being a Prussian of true character, was strict about his duties. Thus this evening he was walking from the Westend Bahnhof, and the hands of the clocks on the platform was not even signalling 10:30. He wasn't due to swap with the guard Schultz until 11. He was used to the streets being quiet at this late hour, and was surprised upon his approaching of the Gilbau by the number of people wandering the streets. As he walked along the Reichsstrasse, he chose not to turn down the Schaumburg Allee, the street down which he would usually walk to get to one of the entrances to the building site, but rather, with the higher number of people on the street, he chose to walk toward the commotion out of curiosity and to use the Sachsenplatz entrance. He didn't trust Schultz. He found him to be fond of slacking on his duties, spending more time in the guard hut with his dog than performing the duties of a guard. He was also known for allowing children to play on the building site, something that he, Gustav Flade, was very much against and had warned Schultz over a few times previously, to which Schultz replied with, "It's my duty, I'll do it how I wish." The closer he got, the more people he could distinguish huddled in groups in the dim of the night that had finally set over Westend. Upon hearing the footsteps of the older gentleman Gustav Flade, a group of several people turned. They watched him as he alternated between the dark and the light of the lanterns that lined the street. Then, upon realizing the figure belonged to that of the authoritative and older gentleman, even he as a lowly watcher commanded, they ran to him. "Herr Flade, Hilda is missing," they spoke. "Hilda who?" Flade returned. There were a fair number of Hildegards and Hildas in the area. "Zäpernick," the group cried. "And you've searched all around, have you?" Flade asked. "Not the building which you guard. Schultz would not allow it." "Have you lights?" None of the group had. "Find some lights and come back." "Any luck?" Theodor Müller asked of Heinrich Asch upon his return from his search at the local hospitals and the police station. "None," Heinrich Asch responded dejectedly. "Yourself?" he asked of the 16-year-old. Theodor Müller had met the returning Heinrich Asch in the middle of the street that separated the Gilbau and Sachsenplatz. "None," Theodor replied with a shake of the head. He had cycled the neighborhood for over 2 hours and found nothing. He, like so many others involved in the search, had gravitated back to the Gilbau. So far in all of the searching, not a trace of the young girl had been found. Not a footstep in the gardens, a piece of fabric on the street, even a sighting. It was, at this moment, as if she had vanished completely. "Who's that?" Heinrich Asch pointed as he spoke towards the silhouette of a lone figure at the gate to the Gilbau. "Well, here's a nice story. What's going on here?" Gustav Flade asked of his colleague, who was stood behind the gate between two columns of stone, his dog tied to a stall. He had entered the building site, placed his bag in the watchman's hut, and found Schultz outside. "Herr Flade, it's you," a voice came from behind the watchman. Flade turned and saw the young Theodor Müller, still pushing his bike, stood at the gates with Heinrich Asch, their eyes turned to Schultz. "Hildegard Zäpernick is missing, I know," Flade interrupted. "We wanted to search the building." "You can't." It was Schultz's turn to interrupt. "We're to guard the site, not to enter the building. We can't let you enter either. It's not safe." "Get a lamp. I'll let you in if you get a light," Flade spoke, overriding his colleague with age and authority. Heinrich Asch quickly disappeared, running to his apartment at number 89, where the lights were still on in the ground floor apartment on the right. He was quick to return, as were others who Flade had told could search the building as long as they had a light, and they gathered beyond the gate on the building site. The group included Wilhelm Zäpernick, Hermann Fulbrugger of number 84 and his son Paul, Wilhelm Feuerhoff of number 91 and his wife Frau Feuerhoff. Wilhelm Feuerhoff noticed a shadowy figure standing in the background and asked of his wife, "Who's that?" "That's the guard Schultz," came his wife's reply. "We'll go together. We'll stick together," Flade iterated. "Workmen don't tidy their tools up often, so be careful." I'll wait here, Theodore Muller said. Can't leave my bicycle out. Very well. Come on, rest of you, Flada spoke and turned toward the building. Now they were beyond the gates and the picketed fence. Those that made up the search party could see more of the building that many of the children had seen, but them as adults, to which barriers represented something not only physically, but also something mentally had not seen before. They could see the masses of building materials piled up on much of the open ground. The real reason the guards were employed was predominantly to ensure that these were not stolen. They could see that the basement windows to the Gilbau were very low, so low, in fact, that they were almost level with the ground. The yellow light cast by the lamps illuminated the recesses of the construction site. As a group, they stood together, raising the lights high so as to cast longer throws across the earth, but they saw nothing, nor did Flada. Once the grounds had been searched, Flada then brought out his loop of keys and unlocked one of the doors to the new building. Exploring the upper floors of the building, first, they wandered past the discarded tools of the day, of wooden chips from joists, cement bags and bricks, but not a trace of Hilda was found. The dog would have been little use. It wasn't trained as a sniffer dog, but rather as a dog for growls and barks, and thus Flada had left it tied to the kennel near the watchman's hut. From the top they worked their way down. Still nothing. All that was left was the basement. Schultz went first and quickly disappeared into the darkness as he ran ahead, leaving the others to cast their light afresh. There was a smell of lime, not the citrus variety, but of the builder's lime used for whitewashing of walls and in the laying of concrete floors. Roofing material was stacked in many of the corners that one day would play host to the no longer required or not so treasured keepsakes of future residents. Flada led the way, the residents bringing flashes of light through the maze of subterranean corridors. Rarely Schultz would reappear, but quickly once again disappear as he ran ahead into the dark. Wilhelm Feuerhoff made a mental note that when Schultz did appear, he always seemed to be smoking. Hilda's name was cried out, but no reply ever came. On and on they searched, glad to have Flada, for it would not be easy to find one's way around the basements and bottoms of elevator shafts in the dark and not get lost. When the search of the cellars had ended, Schultz bid a farewell to Flada and disappeared, and half an hour later, at 2 a.m, the search concluded in vain. Not a trace of Hilda was found, and in the earliest hours of the next day, the tired figures emerged from the building site. Flada made his apologies that nothing was found. The search party disbanded, and now solemnly walked away into the dark of the night to return to their own homes. Flada locked the gates behind them and returned to the guard hut, in which he found some food for the dog that had been tied to the kennel the whole time, and settled in for his usual nightly routine, now that nothing more could be done. Wilhelm Feuerhoff returned to his home at number 91 with his wife. Hermann and Paul Fulbrugger returned to theirs at number 84, and Heinrich Asch returned with Wilhelm Zäpernick to their building at number 89. Slowly the remaining lights in the windows of the flats of the bank of the buildings that belonged to the Reichsbank turned off, allowing the building to blend with the night, apart from one light that remained bright, that of the ground floor apartment on the right at number 89, and of course the light across the road in the guard hut. The truck trundled along. The steel leaf springs of the truck bounced with the cobbles of the road and with the weight of the brick materials in the flatbed. In the tiny and thin cab that was only a fifth of the width as the engine bay that stretched out before them was Wilhelm Schultz, whose name was written on the side, as it was his business, was driving. And with him was his employees, Erich Scheffler and Arthur Dieter. They followed Reichsstrasse and turned onto Sachsenplatz. The Gilbau was already swarming with workers, and the gate that had been locked and guarded by Flada the night before were now open, the guard hut empty. Wilhelm Schultz turns the large wheel and guides the truck through the gate to where they can unload. Pulling up, Dieter and Scheffler jump from the cabin to the ground and moved swiftly around to the flatbed to begin unloading the brick load. "What do you do with her then?" a construction site worker asked of Eric as he approached to help unload the stack of bricks. "What do you mean?" Eric inquired, puzzled what the construction worker meant. "Where did you leave Hilda?" he asked. Eric looked at Arthur, and Arthur to Eric, both puzzled as to what the construction worker was implying, and to which Hilda he was referring. "She was playing around your truck. We see her all the time." There was more and more construction workers, the ones that would help move the bricks, crowding around the truck. Eric and Arthur still were perplexed. When the employees of the Gilbau had arrived to begin their working day, the news of the disappearance of the local girl had spread fast, and with active imaginations, groups had come together to speculate as to what had happened. Some, the previous day, had seen Hilda, her distinctive blonde hair, blue eyes, and spirited attitude, making her well known by sight to the workers, playing around the truck and talking with Eric, and finally the realization came to Eric and Arthur to whom they were referring. Eric was shocked, as was Arthur. They knew Hilda by sight as the other workers did, but although they knew her well, they may not have remembered her name. But she remembered theirs and referred to them both by their first names. "Well, that can't be right," Eric said in reply. "She'd only last night gone and got me cigarettes." The cool light of the new morning had brought no further answers for a community that was in shock and reeling at the loss of one of their own. To have searched so long and so hard, but with the results so grim, in respects to not a single piece of evidence as to what might have happened to the young girl having been found, left the community broken and beyond saddened. With the loss of a child, to a kidnapper, to a murderer, to both perhaps, surely the Zäpernicks had not slept, and with no miraculous return of Hilda smiling and running through the door, it was a day that surely would allow for no rest, only for the pursuit of answers. For the workers of the Reichsbank, they could not stay to help the Zäpernicks in their cause to find their missing daughter. Their jobs would not permit. Even Theodor Müller had, despite staying awake late in the search for Hilda, had to rise early and return to his job as an apprentice baker the next day. However, the disappearance of Hilda was never far from their minds. In the early afternoon of Tuesday, the 13th of August, 1929, Hildegard Zäpernick, aged 11, born on the 11th of August, 1918, became a missing person in the eyes of the police, and the official work was about to begin. It started with a few officers arriving first. They asked the simple questions of passers-by, workers, and the residents. "Do you know Hildegard Zäpernick? Can you describe her? When did you last see her? Would you say she was a happy girl?" They took notes and documented what some had to say, and came to the conclusion that she was, indeed, missing. A quick search with William Grotter of the gardens once again revealed nothing, as did a walk around the open ground of the Gilbau. They asked Frau Zäpernick for a description of her daughter, when she had last seen her, and then departed. It was obvious to the police that something was afoul, and required a department higher than that of their own, and so the case was referred up the ladder. It was also at some time during the morning or early afternoon that the news of the 11-year-old's disappearance made it to the newspapers. But as of yet, it was not so interesting, for that the papers wished to print more than the bare minimum, which they did. Tuesday ended with no news. Hilda was still missing. There was no evidence of foul play, kidnapping, or murder. The police who had been assigned had nothing to go on, but in Abteilung 4, or Department 4, of the Kriminalpolizei, it was unsure as to which branch would take the case. Would it be Inspection A, murder and assault, or E for moral crimes? Or handed to I, the Erkennungsdienst, the service that would search for the minute clues, for fingerprints or traces of fabrics? But none would have a point at which to begin, for no one had a clue what had happened to Hilda. So it was decided a Sonderkommission, a special commission, would be formed, with the case number 6604.IV.K18.29. And they'd start with another search. On Wednesday, the work for the criminal police under the heading Sonderkommission Zäpernick began. Criminal Commissar August Quass was part of the team, along with Criminal Secretary George Rosse, who had been deployed to coordinate the matters on the ground. There was much to be done, and the first thing that they'd ordered was for the pay books of the Gilbau to be made available. They needed to know where everyone was on Monday. But to know where everyone was, they first had to ascertain who everyone was. The pay book for the Gilbau would help greatly. It would list all of the 140 workers contracted to the site and their addresses, making it much easier to have them tracked down by the uniformed police to provide statements and, most importantly, to gather alibis. The criminal commissar began himself by doing a sweep of the area. He walked to number 89 Westend Alley, where from behind drawn curtains curious faces gazed out at the work the police were doing below. He noted how close the Gilbau was to the home, how much of the building could be seen, how secure the wooden fence was, and that it was laced with gaps. There was, as it was a working day nonetheless for the Gilbau, many trucks stood statically on the curb with a variety of construction equipment. He took note that probably vehicles were stood there when Hilda had disappeared. Next was to cover the areas that the residents had scoured on the Monday evening and into the night. Steps had to be retraced and the garden searched once again, but this time not by a gardener looking for broken foliage, but by the trained dogs of the Berlin Polizei. The criminal commissar observed as the dogs, Afra, Beere, Irina, and City, were drawn from their cages within the large automobile used by the dog department of the police, and firstly taken into the park that had been divided into search sectors. It was still the common theory that it must have been an accident that had befallen the young Hilda, and therefore the waters and the crevices of the park needed to be searched in greater depth. From the stone pavilion that resembled a medieval watchtower, Quass could look on. The gardener William Grotter and his assistants had returned to help and to guide the police down into the bottom of the garden. The handlers, dressed in their blue uniforms, used their gummiknüppel to move the foliage from in front of the dogs' noses, and to help point the dogs in a direction they felt may have been better. But still, nothing was found. From the gardens of Sachsenplatz, they were brought to walk the gardens behind the bank of houses at Westend Alley, but again, nothing. Finally, one officer took a dog into the Gilbau building itself, but despite many hours, once again, nothing was found. Now minds were turning to the possibility that if no evidence of Hilda being assaulted, injured, or worse lay on Sachsenplatz, then surely the only reasonable conclusion would be that she was abducted. As the criminal police were going about their work, onlookers were prying. The morbid curiosity of the people as to what was unfolding led to more walks being taken than usual by people who held their heads forwards but cast their gaze to the side. Journeys were diverted and meetings unnecessary held. It was how Martha Bartel, resident of number 85, and her sister Maria Talker found themselves taking an early evening stroll through Sachsenplatz. They had wandered through the higher garden. The one that was at street level, as where the officers and dogs had been, was off limits even in normal circumstances to the general public. They were curious as to what was unfolding, and wanting to turn their ears to the conversations and street-level interrogations of residents and the workers of the construction sites by the criminal police. Slowly they drifted along the pavements that ran along the edge of the park from Reichsstrasse and towards the buildings of Westend Alley. Curiously they gazed at the entrance of the Gilbau, observed the police going about their business, but with nothing to defer, they walked on. It was then that they noticed the figure, a man. He was stood at the corner of the street where Sachsenplatz met Westend Alley. They watched him. He barely moved, but they could see his eyes watching the police vehicles. the great noisy automobiles that emitted the rich-smelling fumes of engines not tuned correctly. They were coming and going, and he watched the movement of the police. His skin was white, and he shook. They witnessed terribly. His hands were barely even able to light the cigarette held within as the flame danced around the loose ends of the rolled tobacco. They waited and watched him further. They watched as he drew deeply on the cigarette a few times, the burning end glowing bright and plumes of smoke belched from his nostrils as he looked on. But after just a few draws, he discarded the cigarette with an anger, as if the cigarette did not hold the answers or release that he was looking for within it. Detectives began to walk the street, then toward the shaking, ghostly white figure, and quickly the figure disappeared into an entrance to the Gilbau. Photographers appeared on the street to take a few photographs, and after they had expended their bulbs, the figure reappeared. He, the mysterious figure, caught sight of the two women, of Martha and her sister, and gazed at them with such intensity that they felt their feet move before they could process the thought of fleeing. They moved quickly back towards the homes of Westend Alley. They looked back at the figure, but the figure was gone. No sooner had they returned their gaze to where their feet were carrying them, they bumped into a man. He was tall and thin, a wide version of the toothbrush moustache on his upper lip, and close-cropped blonde hair. His eyes were tired and bloodshot. He appeared little taken aback by the two women who had crashed into him. "Oh, Herr Zäpernick, we do apologize," Marie said to the man that they had crashed into, and that they now realized was the father of the missing girl. "We had just seen a strange figure standing on the corner smoking. He gave us an awful feeling inside as he stared at us." "Oh," Herr Zäpernick solemnly replied, the grief he was feeling tangible within his voice. "That's the guard. He knows our daughter very well."
Achtung, Achtung. Hier ist die Sendestelle Berlin im Voxhaus. Meine Damen und Herren, das verschwindende 11 Jahre alte
This has been Achtung History's The Watcher, produced by the Berlin Tour Guide and presented by Simon J. James. Follow Achtung History on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Achtung History. Visit the website at theberlintourguide.com/Achtung History and support Achtung History on Patreon at patreon.com/Achtung History.